Hey, my name is Nate. I serve as a husband, as a dad, and one of the pastors as well, and grateful to be with you. We are in our second sermon series called How Do You Feel Today? How are you feeling? And this morning we're talking about fear. Now, several years ago, a couple of years ago, I was talking with my counselor. Every 6 or 8 weeks, I meet with him, and I was meeting with him. Back in the day, it was more reactionary, just trying to work through problems, issues, and trying to have someone speak into my life. I really try to be accountable and solicit wisdom. And so I was talking with him, and I said, I think one of the primary struggles I have is sometimes anger, to be sinfully angry. Anger can be a good emotion. It's actually, we see in the scriptures in Ephesians, be angry and do not sin. So most of us will say, well, my anger is most of the time not sinful. Your anger is probably most of the time sinful. So we are champs at deceiving ourselves. And so I said, hey, I think my struggle is anger. And I've written blog posts on it. I've read books. I've spoken into it. I've thought about it, studied it. And I even memorized a definition, thinking that I would somehow impress my coach, my soul care, my counselor. And I said, anger is a whole person response towards some perceived injustice that's thrust upon you, and waiting for him to be like, man, you're just so amazingly wise, you know? And I said, think about that. Fear, anger is a whole person response. Isn't it amazing when somebody slights you and somebody does something to you, whether they know it or not, and you can be singularly focused with your words and your actions and your thoughts and your affections about the seemingly perceived injustice that's thrust upon you. Oftentimes, we have such an arbitrary sense of justice, what is right or wrong. And so thinking that somehow I convinced him, he said this, Nate, I do think that at times you struggle with anger, but I don't think anger is your primary struggle. I think your primary struggle is perhaps the emotion of fear. And here's what I said. I said, hey, listen, I got to be honest with you. I'm like the least fearful person you've ever met. And you're like, sounds very humble of you, Nathan. And he says, hey, why don't you be quiet? Because you're paying me right now. And I said, that's a fair point. I received that. And he goes, I think that you struggle with fear, and here's why. He goes, you like to be seen and want to be seen as competent and in control. And when your competency is questioned and your control is perhaps removed, you respond out of fear with an action-oriented emotion called anger. Have you ever had times in your life when somebody says something to you that was so crystal clear, they nailed you to the wall and it's left an indelible impression upon you and it was a spiritual marker in your life? Yeah, I've never had any of those either. So when he said that, I was like, that's me. I want to be seen as competent. I like to make decisions. I like to be in control. And oftentimes, out of fear of losing control, what's going to happen with marriage or family or church or situations or this or these decisions? One of the worst times for a preacher is always Sunday afternoons where you think about what you said, what you should have said, and I didn't mean to say that. I wonder if I'm going to email, I wonder how that landed. I want to be seen as competent. So out of fear. And I think there's a lot of fear in the room. Maybe perhaps not with competency and control, but I think there's a lot of fear, people in the room and people online, and we'll talk through that this morning. Now, the Greek word fear is the word phobos. It's where phobias, right? And so here's some fears that are present. Perhaps this is you. Arachnophobia, right? Made famous by the movie Arachnophobia. Fear of spiders and arachnids, okay? What about this? I've said it before, ophidiophobia, fear of snakes. My dad would say this, Nathan, I'm only fearful of 2 kinds of snakes. I'm like, well, what kinds are those? He said, dead ones and alive ones. And I was like, Dad, you're such a goober. And I find myself saying the same things, and my kids now think that I'm a nerd, and there's like this generational curse of dadisms. And so now it's fine. I say it, no big deal. I'm secure. Here's one that every middle school boy struggles with. You ready? Blutophobia, the fear of bathing. Every middle school boy has this fear. They're there, right? What about this? Spectrophobia, the fear of mirrors and one's own reflection, a legitimate fear. You may have that fear. It's legitimate. It's there. So we're talking through fear. Is fear a good thing, bad thing? Is there an impairment of fear? Is there a gift of fear? Fear is that emotion which moves us to provide for our security as we think evil or impending danger. Our radar goes up, danger, evil, alert, and it makes us face ourselves and reveals neediness. There's a formula of fear. Fear makes us face ourselves and reveals our neediness. There's the gift of fear, which leads to trust and wisdom. And there's the impairment of fear, which has been characterized as leading us to like paralyzing anxiety or even rage. And we'll talk more about that here in just a moment. Fear is your body asking you to be vulnerable and acknowledge your neediness to gain healthy control. Rage, the impairment of fear, is refusing to acknowledge our fear and express vulnerability. Rage-filled people, this is different than anger. Rage-filled people are almost always terrified at exposing their hearts. They're almost always terrified of vulnerability as a defense mechanism used to conceal our neediness and hide our vulnerability. I know you perhaps may know what's going on, but I'm not going to let you in. Don't you even try. And at times people respond with rage, the impairment of fear, anxiety, to be paralyzed by our fear. But God doesn't want us to be paralyzed by fears. Fear can be a really good thing. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The gift of fear is it moves us to wisdom. Wisdom in Proverbs chapter 8, the personification of wisdom. If wisdom kind of showed up and walked on the aisle, the wisdom that we see in Proverbs 8 is the person of Christ. The personification manifested, the incarnation. God revealed himself. He became flesh and blood. Wisdom. So the gift of fear that we have in our lives should move us to wisdom, a person, applying and appropriating truths, but it should also lead us to trust. It should lead us to trust. So in Psalm 142, we're going to read this together. This is David recounting events that happened in 1 Samuel chapter 22 and chapter 24, and he's singing this psalm. He's written this down, and he is a man who's struggling with desperation. Got some anxiety. He's got some fear, some dread. He even says that here in the psalm. So let's, as is our custom, let's stand and read Psalm 142 together. If you're physically able to and willing, let's read Psalm 142 together out loud. Here we go. With my voice, I cry out to the Lord. With my voice, I plead for mercy to the Lord. I pour out my complaint before him. I tell my trouble before him. When my spirit faints within me, you know my way, and the path where I walk, they have hidden a trap for me. Look to the right and see. There is none who takes notice of me. No refuge remains to me. No one cares for my soul. I cry to you, O Lord. I say, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Attend to my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are too strong for me. Bring me out of prison, that I may give thanks to your name. The righteous will surround me, for you will deal bountifully with me. This is God's word, the God who created heaven and earth, the God who is transcendent and mighty and awesome and loving and for us, has written down his words for you and for me. And we said together, thanks be to God. All right, you may be seated. As I said, David wrote this psalm as he's recounting and thinking back over the events that happened in 1 Samuel chapter 22 and 24. He begins with a sincere prayer there in verses 1 through 2. He moves to declare that he has no place to hide. He's in dread. He's fearful. And in verses 5 to 7, he returns to the Lord and he prays him and he says out loud, declaring to himself, God, you are my refuge. This psalm, there's a gloomy feel to this psalm. It's characterized by a desperate need. He's in desperation. He's fearful. It speaks to Christians whose circumstances take us through deep waters. And as we look right in front of us, for sure, I don't know if I have hope. I'm discouraged. I'm anxious. I'm fearful about what's going on. He says in the first couple verses, I cry aloud. I lift up my voice. I pour my soul out to you. Here's my complaint. And he says in verse 3, when my spirit grows faint in me, you know my way. When he has sunk so low that he's ready to give up, David finds reassurance in the fact that nothing that comes into his life catches God by surprise. He says, it is you who knows my way. And then there's this, again, this recommitment, this commitment to prayer. We're going to do this at the end of the service, so I'm going to ask you to come forward if you feel comfortable. You can stay where you are, but oftentimes I feel like sometimes physical activity makes us think about what we're doing. You can certainly stay where you are, but I want to encourage you to come because I think there's a lot of people that are struggling with fear. I struggle with fear, and we're going to bring our fears to the Lord. So I'm going to invite you here in just a little bit to pray. I want us to be a praying church. I want us to be a needy church, a reliant church, and we can do all the things, music and preaching and ministries and guest services and parking and all of the things, and we can do it without God. I don't want to do it without God. So once a month, we're going to try to have a concerted amount of time in the service where we pray. I think perhaps a lot of us don't have the personal transforming presence of prayer in our lives because we don't see it modeled in the corporate gathering. So I want to model, I want to teach, I want us to pray together. David's point is this: when I sense peril, when I sense danger, I'm going to call upon the name of the Lord. He's my safety. He is my refuge. When I feel trapped, I'm going to pray. When I feel as if I don't have anywhere to go, I'm going to pray. And it's not hard to imagine, as we just read this psalm, his spirit fainting within, meaning dread, discouragement, anxiety, fear. He enters the cave. I've been to this cave. It's in En-Gedi. We're going to Israel February 5th through the 14th next year. There's an interest meeting July 30th. So if you want to come to Israel, go to that meeting. You can get details at the Next Steps area. But I've been to this cave, and David enters into the cave, and who follows in after him? Saul, this murderous king who wants to eliminate David. This king who has been pursuing David enters the cave, and perhaps this is when David silently, not out loud, perhaps this is when David silently prayed, still you know my path, because my path out is blocked by this king. I can't go anywhere. And he realizes that Saul does not know that he's in there. Fear, dread. What stands between you and the gift of fear, which is wisdom and trust, right? We've got fear. David had fear, but the gift of fear, alert, danger, is wisdom and trust. David did it all throughout the psalm. It's not that he was denying fear. He's embracing his fear, and it moved him to trust in God as his refuge, as his safety, and have wisdom in the midst of this troubling, perhaps life-threatening situation. What stands between you and wisdom and trust? Perhaps it's the betrayal of a spouse, and fear has just ravaged your mind. Maybe rage, maybe anxiety. What about the thought of really being vulnerable? I don't really want people to know who I am. The loss of a job, marital or relational difficulties, and you're not quite sure what the other side looks like. Maybe rejection. You fear rejection, and so you're never going to be vulnerable. You're never going to really know. People are never going to really know you. Maybe it's the rampant wickedness and depravity, and you feel it encroaching upon your heart, your friendships, your marriage, your family. Perhaps you feel it encroaching upon your church and you're fearful. Maybe you just fear circumstances that haven't even happened yet. You're someone who incessantly worries and is anxious, and you try to protect yourself from pain. Maybe it's simply walking into a room and not knowing anybody. Is anybody going to care? One of the things that that Pastor David preached on a couple weeks ago, that my friend's going to preach on in a couple weeks, on loneliness. Maybe there's this fear of loneliness, and we had a myriad of singles respond to the survey, and one of the things they said is, if I were to die, I think it would be days or weeks before anybody found me. When I read that, man, I wept. It hurt my heart. the fear of loneliness, of not being missed. The quality of your life depends on the quality of your relationships. Let's say it out loud. The quality of your life depends on the quality of your relationships. What does David write? What does he pray? Still, in the midst of my circumstances, you know my path. Nothing that has happened, that has transpired, has caught you by surprise. And a Christian is somebody who confessionally with their mouth and functionally with their feet actually says, I trust in you. I believe in your wisdom and you're my refuge. And discipleship, following after Jesus, becoming more and more like Jesus, you've got what we sing about and what we talk about in the foyer, and we talk once we've opened the Bible and we've read and we've had some time with Jesus, and so we profess and we confess, God, you're good, I trust in you, you're my refuge, you're my safety, you're my joy. Taste and see that the Lord is good. And then when hardships come in, when suffering happens, when difficult circumstances arise, sometimes what we profess with our lips and what we do with our feet don't match. There's dissonance, there's a disconnect. And the posture and the responsibility of our fellowship of Christ is we want more and more, we want that gap to come together. And sometimes there's highs where we get it right. And sometimes there's lows where we struggle, right? I just want you to know it's okay to struggle. It's okay to struggle. Be more kind to yourself. Be more gentle to yourself. David, in the midst of his dread and fear for his life, not just a diagnosis, not just a trouble in his marriage, not just things are going difficult, loss of job. The kingdom's been taken from him, and there's a guy on hot pursuit that wants to murder him. And his dread and his fear, what does he do? He turns to God, who is his safety and his refuge. The quality of your life depends on the quality of your relationships. Fear, the gift of fear, should drive us to wisdom and trust. To trust God, is all wise. He moves on. He knows that Saul is unaware. I mean, David's in the cave there in En Gedi. Saul comes in. Saul does not know he's there. Perhaps he's not accustomed and attuned to what's going on, the structure of the cave. It's dark, and David's confidence and courage grows increasingly. His captor has fallen into his hands. This might be the time when he's so bold and brazen, but perhaps what does he do? He simply cuts off the hem of Saul's garment. He had him. And in his anxiety and in his taking things into his own hand, he cuts off the hem of his robe, not leading him to trust and wisdom. God, you've seemingly given to me. God didn't want him to smite Saul. Didn't lead him to trust and wisdom. What does David do? You can read it in the Psalms. No one regards him. His plan of escape has been eliminated. No one seemingly cares for my soul. Saul is out to kill him and has infiltrated the very place that he was using to hide. Where will David turn? Verses 5-7. What's he do? He identifies God as his refuge. Even when the hiding place of the cave has been compromised, he's in Saul's presence when he can't roam about Israel as the rightful king anointed by Samuel. Whom does David still have? The Lord. I don't want to be trite. I don't want to give Christian cliches, but I think perhaps when I say things that you have the Lord and he has not and he will not and he forever will not abandon you, perhaps the reason why I don't think that's the most compelling and it doesn't bring me comfort as much as it should, and perhaps even with you, it doesn't bring you as much comfort as it should, is because we hold the things of the world more tightly than we do Jesus. We care more about a diagnosis. We care more about financial security. We care more about peace. We care more about our comfort than we do the presence and the promises of God in our lives. I'm not trying to Jesus juke you. I'm just telling you, as a brother and a member of this church and one of the pastors, I hold the things of the world much more tightly than I do sometimes the promises and the presence of God in my life. And then I'm crushed at times when things don't go the way that I want them to. And that's where my trust really is. My refuge, my trust, my safety, my peace is in a good diagnosis. It's in relationships going well. It's in monetary security. It's in my reputation. And God is unrelentingly committed. He wants every part of who we are. This psalm, David's life, anticipates the life of Jesus. David is the one experiencing suffering and hardship, but later is going to be found triumphant, as we know this in the Word. This psalm and others are a precursor in so many ways to the life of Jesus. Jesus, who experienced sorrow, the man of sorrows, the one who was intimately familiar with grief and fear. And his fear, healthy fear, it drove him to trust the Father, the wisdom of the Father. In fact, we see that and Peter writes about this very thing. He trusted himself. He yielded his life to the one who judges justly. He even said, I commit my soul to you. The phrase commit is a phrase that means I'm giving my soul to you in safekeeping because you're going to take care of me. I don't need to fear. God, you're going to take care of me. And 3 days later, what happened? The resurrection. All of history hinges on this truth that Jesus committed himself to trust in the Father, the humanity of Christ, trusting in the Father that there was this plan. The gift of fear is trust and wisdom. Let me give you an example of how the gift of fear leads us to trust and wisdom. Last Saturday, 2 Saturdays ago, we got a lot of rain. Anybody have their yards or houses flood? We had a ton of rain. And I have this little creek that flows into Buck Creek, and there's this culvert that if you don't pay attention, it gets clogged. And I have said many times that when there's a lot of rain, you could take a boogie board down the creek. You could take a kayak. So I thought, I need to be a man of my words. I need to take a boogie board down this creek. So that's what I did. I got a boogie board out of storage. I walked about 100 yards. I got into the back of my neighbor's backyard. It was about 2 to 4 feet. I'm telling you, it was like Class 3 rapids from West Virginia, y'all, in my backyard. And I got in the creek, and I boogie boarded like body surfed about 100 yards. It was awesome until I hit a boulder. And I got launched off. I could not gain my traction for about 15 feet. I think I bruised a rib. It's been kind of hard to laugh. And so that happened last week. And I went to go get my boogie board, and it was another 100 yards down by the culvert. At this time, the whole thing is clogged. It's dangerous. So I got in the water. I was like, I'm gonna remove these tree trunks because I work out and I can lift trees and stuff like that. And I thought to myself, Graceland just went through a succession plan, Pastor Laird and me. It's probably too early to have another one. So perhaps, why don't we, in my fear, alerting my heart to danger, this is a good thing, why don't you exemplify a little bit of wisdom? So that's what I did. Aren't you proud that I did that? See, they're very easy. Thank you. I hope some of you clap. Okay. People are like, you should have just go ahead and gone. Okay. Wisdom. The gift of fear is trust and wisdom. Fear moves us to take ownership of our fears, acknowledge our neediness, to be vulnerable. What does David do in this psalm? He recognizes what is in front of him literally, not figuratively. He recognizes what is in front of him literally. And the gift of fear is that you see danger and it facilitates learning. We need something. We need to trust. We need wisdom. We need help. We need reliance. We need trust. We need to lean in. We need to be dependent. We need collaboration. In the face of fear, we can face our need for help, and we can discover opportunities to be reliant upon other people, to open up our hearts and to open up our lives to other people in order to ask for help. But a lot of us don't want to ask for help. I don't want to be seen as vulnerable. If I have to be dependent, if I have to be reliant, if I have to surrender to someone, if I have to risk vulnerability, then I don't want this fear thing. I'm just going to stay in control. And control, my friends, is an illusion. You're not really in control. Fear teaches us that we are needy, vulnerable individuals, and we need God's wisdom, and we need to trust in him. If our purpose, we've seen this throughout the Old Testament and throughout the New Testament, if our purpose is to worship God with every facet of who we are and to love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and Jesus is simply saying, love God with the totality of who you are, with every ounce of your being, you're to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. If that's our posture, if that's our responsibility, then that means we got to open ourselves up and be vulnerable. Acknowledging fear, and in doing that, we'll grow and we'll change. We'll lean into wisdom. We'll lean into wisdom, and our trust will deepen as we understand the perfect love that was brought forth in Christ cast out fear, unhealthy fear, because the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, which drives us to Jesus, to trust in him. C.S. Lewis said this about love, about being vulnerable. To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything in your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, and airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. To love is to be vulnerable. One of the things I want you to see in this series, the quality of your life depends on the quality of your relationships, is that we need to be vulnerable. The way of Jesus is the way of love. He's our refuge. He's our safety. He's our peace. He's our provision. He's our presence. And I want to read this. I'm going to read it twice because I need to hear it twice. As we acknowledge our fear, then our neediness, in our vulnerability, we, in wisdom and trust, see a God who was always there, who never leaves us, who is powerful, who is in control, and he is for us. And as we do that, we become increasingly reliant upon him, and our trust grows and our wisdom deepens, and anxiety and worry and rage become less and less of a hold on our lives. I'm going to read it again because I think that's really good. As we acknowledge our fear, then our neediness and our vulnerability, we, in wisdom and trust, see a God who has always been there, who never leaves us, who is powerful and who is in control, and he is for you and for me. And as we do that, we become increasingly reliant upon him, and our trust in his character and his ways and his promises grows, and our wisdom deepens, and anxiety and worry and rage become less and less of a hold on our lives. The gift of fear is wisdom and trust. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, to lean into the person and the work of Jesus. He's our safety, our refuge, our peace, our presence. So I love what one Christian author said, and then we'll close with a time of prayer. Now, in this knowledge of fear, go hug your children, kiss your father, tell your mother of your hurt. Talk about being vulnerable. Tell God you need more. Tell your spouse or friend you were wrong. Admit your lack of self-sufficiency, your inability to control your circumstances, and your desire and hunger for love. Release your anxiety, embrace your fears, pursue wisdom, grow in trust, reach out for help, and give it away. The quality of your life depends on the quality of your relationships. The gift of fear is that leads us to trust in God, and in so doing, be people of wisdom. Father, would you see fit in these moments, these next several moments, to do work in our hearts? That we might be a people who understand what your word says, that we are emotional beings. You have created us that way, and that we would do some heart work and think and discern about what we fear and at times how that paralyzes us should move us to trust in you, to seek your wisdom. Your wisdom helps us navigate life in a God-honoring way, your best, your will, your desires. And so we want to trust in you. We pray this with expectation. Amen.